Hey listeners, it's Natalie, and today I've got a conversation with my friend Ryan Maher from Cornell, formerly from the Cornell Small Farm Program, about deep compost mulch. If that sounds familiar, it might be because Jesse talked about Ryan's research on his daily podcast several weeks ago or months ago. I don't know, I lose track of time. Ryan and his colleagues were able to do an 8-year research project comparing essentially different farming systems, not just different farming practices. And it yielded a wealth of agroecological and economic data. As Jesse discussed, and Ryan readily admits, there were some limitations to the research, as there always are. But as with any good research project, it set the groundwork for additional questions, especially when it comes to the different phases of a farming system, sort of the setup or establishment phase, the maintenance phase, and how we might best manage that balance between nutrient management and weed management when it comes to using mulch, especially compost mulch. This was farmer-led research, and I want to give a lot of credit to the researchers at the University of Maine and Cornell for recognizing this emerging deep compost mulch system when they did nearly a decade ago. It's no small feat to maintain a research trial for 8 years, and it's really great to have this wealth of data. So here's my conversation with Ryan.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count. And I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. All right, enjoy the show.
Thank you for being here. You and I go pretty far back, I'd say, because there's not a lot of researchers doing this sort of small scale, no-till, tarp stuff. And so we connected years ago. And if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners, that would be great.
Sure. Well, currently I work as the organic farm coordinator with the Cornell Agricultural Experiment Station based in Ithaca, New York, supporting organic research and outreach at Cornell Research Farms and a student farm on campus. But as you say, Natalie, we met in my capacity working as a research and extension specialist within the Cornell Small Farm Program. It was about 10 years that I was there, focused on soil health practices and vegetables. And the latter half of that was really on small scale practices to support the farms that I love to work with. So that's me the last 10 years or so. Always been interested in agroecology, soils, plants, and a research perspective. I mean, I worked in prairie systems, alfalfa corn rotations, and more recently vegetables. So that's really my background. And what I love to do, and what brought me to Cornell Small Farms, was working in extension and connecting with farmers, the same types of farmers that I used to work on when I was younger.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of small scale farmers tend to rely on each other for information. They're often ignored by researchers, but when you were working at Cornell Small Farms, you did a lot of research on specifically the deep compost mulch systems. So I was wondering if you could tell me how this came about and sort of briefly what you did, and we'll get into the details as we go. And then just for the sake of, giving credit where credit is due, someone had to pay for this research. So where did you all get the money to do this work?
The reality is Cornell has been doing this work in reduced tillage systems for vegetables for a really long time, basically supporting farmers, conducting trials with a focus on mid to large scale operations. Lots of research in strip tillage over the years. So credit to Anu Ragaraja and all her work at Cornell and as director of the Cornell Small Farm Program. So when I started in 2013, there was kind of a transition going on within small farms, within our projects, starting to focus more on organic systems and small scale operations. And so we received in 2013 a rather large grant that helped us work with the University of Maine and Michigan State. That was through the USDA Organic Research and Education Initiative. And that grant got us to do this kind of work for about 5 years. It continued after that, but that was the start. And what's most interesting about that grant is that it was really designed to incorporate farmers' practices in our research, in our trials at the Freeville Research Station. We wanted to put in the same practices that farmers were using, leading farmers were using at the time, in order to adopt no-till. And so we had a meeting of about 11 of these farmers around the Northeast and the Northern Tier. Two of them kind of opened my eyes and the group's eyes to these two practices, one being tarps and the other of compost mulch or deep compost. That specifically was Jay Armour at Four Winds Farm in the Hudson Valley of New York. So basically we learned from these farmers how they were doing their work, how they being successful, and what was working for them. And we wanted to put them and insert their practices within our trials. And so that's what we did. And that's how we designed what we would call this long-term permanent bed research experiment, which we carried on for 8 years. And we put different practices, both tillage and mulching practices, side by side, and looked at from year to year how these practices added up, how they affected everything from crop yields to weeds to our soils. And so it turned into a very complicated experiment with farmer input and researcher input, where we had between different levels of tillage and different mulches, like 18 different treatments over half an acre and a quarter, 72 plots. It was very complicated, and that's what we were charged to maintain and to support other farmers in learning more about these practices and how they could or could not adopt them and what they could expect. So to try to translate some of these other farms practices for others based on our research. Specifically, we tested 4 different tillage treatments that we've talked about in articles, that represent a gradient of tillage from conventional tillage with the rototiller to shallow tillage, which basically is the equivalent of just like adjusting the tiller to go half as deep. And then no-till practices using hand tools, and then no-till using a tarp. And again, Rick Baruch talking about tarps in this intensive meeting. We basically, without any understanding of how to use and manage tarps, used this as a practice and learned on the fly. Kind of like a farmer would. Exactly. Yes. It's amazing, especially in long-term trials, how much you're going to modify, you're going to adapt. And that's the beauty of it. Actually, we just have to own up to how we manage these systems over time, and we're not going to continue to do something that's failing. We're going to try to adapt, and that's what farmers are going to do. And so, within each of those 4 tillage systems, we used, as we talked about, deep compost mulch. Compare that to a rye mulch, and then a no mulch. So we had 4 tillage, 3 mulch treatments that we maintained over We maintained these over 8 years in total, and we've been sharing research and results more so from the first 4 years recently.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how long it takes. Like, you said you started this in did you say you started 2013, this project?
Well, I started in 2013, and then we implemented the long-term trial in 2015.
Yeah. So, and I think you all have actually been really timely in getting your research out, but it's just the process of research is very involved. And I do want to give you a lot of credit for having a significant extension component and outreach component to your work, because I know that a lot of times in academia, our currency is publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. And that is literature that doesn't always make it to farmers. But you have done a really good job of, putting on webinars and writing articles. And a few weeks ago, farmer Jesse actually talked about your article in Growing for Market. And he was really grateful that you took the time to write up the work in non-scientific language. But he did have some critiques, and I think they're fair, and I think it's worth discussing sort of why you did what you did, the decisions you made, just sort of everything involved in doing this kind of research, and some of the points that are still questions for future research. So you mentioned that you had 72 plots, and I was just hoping you could kind of get into what it means to do research, like what it means to have replicated plots and data collection and the kinds of data that you all collected to make this project.
Oh, this is a tall task.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, and there's actually extra layers to something like this that's long term, where you're inheriting your practices, and you need to come back to the same places year after year. So that's like as simple as like marking your fields so that your beds don't move when you're operating on a farm or in a field that typically isn't divided and managed in that way. Then you have to put a lot of effort into just this idea of maintaining your plots over time. And so a plot, we talk about 72 of them, consists of 3 beds that were 4 foot wide with 2 foot pathways in between and 25 foot long. So we had 72 of these plots. All the data that we collected was from the middle bed. So another component is like we want to reduce variability, or that is attributed to neighboring plots, movement of nutrients, weeds. And so always sampling from the center of those plots. So we have to have plots that are large enough to minimize that kind of interference from other plots, and also plots that are large enough to collect the type of data that we want to get good representations of yield, to get good representations of labor use, which was kind of a big one. We wanted to track the labor that went into all of these, all the practices, from applying the mulches to laying tarps and hand weeding. And so you have to have plots that are at least large enough to give you a reasonable estimate of that. And so, so I mean, these are just some of the considerations around research design and plot management. One thing that I should also probably mention is that we were not the only farm doing this. We managed on a research farm in Freeville, New York, Thompson Vegetable Research Farm, but we were in collaboration with the University of Maine down in Monmouth with Mark Hutton. And so we were trying to actually do the same thing at their location there. And to coordinate that among all these different kinds of potential management factors is a very big ask. especially, there's only so much that we could synchronize, they used perhaps smaller tools. We had access to some larger tools to use. For example, we used more equipment than they did. They used more walk-behind, tractor-based equipment, I should say, versus their walk-behind equipment. But we grew the same crops. We measured the same things, but the ways in which we managed were specific to the farm, just like it would be on any other farm that would try to adopt these things. So because of that influences both plot size, coordination with another research farm. What kind of data can we both get? What kind of data will we as an individual location focus on? What crops can we expect to grow successfully at both locations and not lose a year of data? Those types of things all came into play in thinking about experimental design. And then add the layer of farmer practices that we've never used before, like deep compost. And getting on the phone and talking with Jay and saying how he would manage in that system. How do you manage weeds in that system? Learning the importance of controlling weeds from going to seed. So we put a lot of effort in that, actually, at our location in particular, to minimize seed rain from mature weeds. Those kinds of considerations go into to see if we have all these different systems, how would a farmer potentially, what kind of effort would they put in to make it successful? And so these Brian Caldwell and I, who wrote the Growing for Market article that more recently, and who I worked with for a good bit of my time at small farms, I credit him for every day that we are out in the field trying to think about the best way to manage something or alter our methods in order to be successful. Thinking, well, how would a farmer do this? Basically, he was an organic farmer and continues to be an organic farmer for many, many years. So between the two of us out in the field, staring at things, making decisions about whether we should be flame weighting this or what tools would be best to manage this. When should we apply the mulch? How should we apply the mulch? And then orchestrating students through the whole process as well, because the labor on a research farm a lot of times comes from undergraduate students, and those students are different every year. So bringing them on board and teaching them to count weeds and be methodical and looking at different weed species, or to practice their hoeing and non-data rows so that they are synchronized and not biased towards, and getting all these students to carry on practices after year after year after years. It's not actually talked about a lot, I don't think, but that's really the hand labor on research farms, is these undergraduate students learning what it takes to do applied research.
And I think as far as the replication, a lot of times you will see in agricultural research that there are 4 replicates, and there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason behind 4. It tends to be like, when we have 4, we can often pick up the signal through the noise. When there's 3 replications, you often can't pick up the signal. 5 would be nice, but it's more plots. But I think my point is that a lot of times when people want to try something, understandably, on a farm, they have a side-by-side strips. Say, well, I want to try this new practice, and then here's my old practice. I'll just do these 2 things side by side. And you can get a lot of anecdata when you do that. You can observe things, but statistically, you can't really show anything when you just plant 2 things side by side. You have to get that replication. And so I think that's what's really different about doing research than actually farming. And it's hard to really understand how involved that becomes very quickly.
Yeah, to multiply the experiment. It's one thing to have all these different combinations, but then you have to do it 4 times in 4 separate plots and randomize them and pick up the tractor, the rototiller from one and go to the other and figure out how to move the tarp from the other. And yeah, there's a lot of orchestrating in order to have them all in the same field. It gets pretty complicated. You walk around, you always have a plot map in your back pocket, and a lot of tracking of where you are and when you have to when each of these systems change within a field. It's not like in a farmer's field, as you're saying. It's that side by side. It's just like, strip all the way down. Well, no, every 25 feet we're changing this practice.
And it's what we love. This is what we choose to do. It's fun. It's what we love. But it just means that sometimes we have to make decisions about what we're looking at, because an experiment, the number of experimental units or plots can just explode and become unmanageable. And so that kind of brings me to one of the first critiques that Jesse had, which is crop choice in your research. So you chose cabbage and winter squash, and you chose to grow just one. I guess those are both relatively longer season crops, but they're not particularly high value crops. So I'm curious why you chose those.
Yeah, there's a lot of considerations, I think, to go into crop choice. And Jesse would not be the first person to say, why are you growing these 2 crops? They're like the lowest value crops on my farm. I definitely heard that before. But in the case of cabbage, we've actually done a lot of research where we're looking at reduced tillage systems and nitrogen supply, and cabbage has kind of been a go-to crop for us. It's a brassica, easier to grow than other brassicas.
And you harvest it once.
You harvest it one time. Marketability is not as finicky as something like broccoli, where you have to really. There's all other considerations around it. Cabbage is a relatively straightforward brassica crop to grow that is very responsive to nitrogen as well. We're primarily, one of our questions is around, when you think about compost, or you think about tarps, or you think about applying mulches, you think about nitrogen availability. And so we wanted cabbage to be that indicator crop for us. So that's, we call it a cabbage bias. We have a lot. We have used cabbage in a lot of those. It's transplanted crop too. Both of these are transplanted crops. We felt like that was a representative brassica that met the kind of the research question goals.
I used cabbage for my dissertation research too.
I know you did.
I'm a big fan of cabbage.
You also have a nice cabbage. Anu loves cabbage. She continues to love cabbage. A lot of our strip till work was in cabbage. There was a lot of cabbage growers actually when we were doing all that work that we were serving.
It also tends. I mean, there's kind of mixed results, but it's hard when you're doing tillage research, and you've got no-till and till, and you to decide if you want a crop that tends to be somewhat sensitive to compacted soil or less sensitive to compacted soil. So that's just another consideration too when you're choosing that indicator crop. And like I chose cabbage, it tends to be less sensitive to compaction.
When it comes to organic no-till, in 2015, we really did not have a lot of experience doing this. So I think about it now as, if I were to work with a farmer to try to implement a practice on their farm like this, which is to me pretty dramatic, just going to no-till, a brassica crop like cabbage would probably be one of those crops that I would recommend, as well as winter squash. Something that's like low risk and maybe responsive to that change, basically. So, I mean, it's often the case when I would do on-farm trials is try to work with a crop, those transplanted crops where the seedbed Doesn't have to be perfect. Residues, might get in the way, but aren't going to make or break planting into it. And so that's why, to be honest, why we didn't start with any direct seeded crops, is because we weren't sure what kind of seed bed we were dealing with when we were transplanting into these. Much easier for us to do on the first go. So that's cabbage. Winter squash is more of that long season crop, I think, especially when you think about tarps. You're asking a lot. You're putting tarps down before planting, taking them off, and you're letting the crop go after that. And you're asking tarps to take care of weeds or something, or all the whatever you're asking them to do throughout that season. And having a long season crop, like where you can't necessarily get in there and weed after the canopy is full. Winter squash kind of serves that niche in a way. The kind of, okay, it's the crop's on its own. What do the weeds look like under the canopy when it dies? That kind of thing. Not a particularly responsive crop to nitrogen, winter squash, but that was where we were at when it came to choosing something that was a longer season, takes us into the fall. So a relatively simple cropping system, but I think that had to be balanced with a relatively complicated tillage and mulch management system that we were after. So that's kind of the trade-off. We have these treatment combinations that add so much complexity. How do we kind of use the crop to not be as complicated, especially when we're coordinated across locations and we're to look at certain measures and not lose data within the course of the experiment.
Yeah. So it's a simplified model system.
Yeah. And we might talk about this later, but we definitely recognize that. And as I've mentioned, we continued the experiment for 8 years in total. And after we went through this iteration of cabbage, winter squash, we added other crops based on farmer input and what we learned in other experiments. And it got more complicated from a rotation perspective, and we had a few less tillage treatments to manage. So we added lettuce, and we added broccoli within the same year, and we added beets, and we had an OP cover crop across the entire plot in fall. So
I do want to get into that because I think there's some really interesting things that happened in sort of year 5 to 8 that are also very relevant to farmers transitioning to a system like this. But I want to go back to this other question about nutrients. So in your Growing for Market article, and then in the peer-reviewed article that was based on, you did talk a lot about how the compost mulch addition affected carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so if you could talk about kind of what were the quantities of compost that you were adding, both in like inches and what that means in terms of tons, and then what that means in terms of the amount of nutrients that you were adding to the system.
Yeah, so we added compost annually in the spring of every year before planting. I had no idea how much compost it would require in order to have a 1.5 to 2 inch layer. Didn't really know what that rate was.
But that notion was coming from your conversations with Jay, sort of how
exactly.
much to add.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's like we need to have a good enough layer here to, this isn't. I mean, we are changing soil organic matter and nutrients dramatically, but this is driven by weed suppression as a mulch. We're thinking about compost as a mulch in a lot of primarily here. So how are we going to suppress weeds with a mulch? And so we were aiming for that 1.5 to 2 inch thickness, right? And playing around with the spreader and figuring out what that looks like. And then as we applied it, we put a little tarp down in the plot every plot we applied it in, and raked it smooth, and then pulled the tarp off, and then threw the tarp on the scale to figure out, like, okay, how much actually is this in this at this rate. So what we determined is that the fresh weight, so like in the field, we're basically applying a thickness and a 1.5 to 2 inch layer of compost, which is a pretty big range there. Is 100 tons per acre, a rate of compost, which to us was enormous. But that's what we were applying. That's in fresh weights. So that amount of compost, based on the amount of every year we would send this compost in for analysis, figure out how much, what was the nutrient content of it. It's about 800 pounds of total nitrogen that we're applying every time we apply. So every year, which is at least 6 times as much nitrogen compared to what we're doing in a standard practice with organic fertilizer and some of the other plots. Not all, of course, in available form, but total nitrogen, we're applying at least 800 pounds of nitrogen.
I want to put 800 pounds of nitrogen in context. Like you said, this is not necessarily all available nitrogen. This is mostly organic nitrogen. So it has to be mineralized to be inorganic nitrogen. And it's mostly inorganic nitrogen that is more susceptible to losses. But like one of the things that Jesse said was, well, if you grew more crops, then you probably wouldn't have lost as much nitrogen, because at the end of it all, you measured the amount of nitrogen that was still in the system. And there was a lot of nitrogen that you had applied that was not accounted for and couldn't be accounted for in your crop removal.
To be honest, I mean, we have, of course, estimate. We have an estimate of what we put on, this stock of inputs, and then we have an estimate of what is in the soil at the end of 4 years. And, we're missing half of it. So we're trying to figure out, in next steps would be, well, where did it go?
There's no way that growing an additional crop in rotation or an additional 2 crops in rotation could account for that much nitrogen. It's just the crop removal rates are not that high. I
don't believe they are. I mean, I do think we could certainly tinker with this rotation, no doubt, in order to have more cover crops and there's in the rotation. But we're applying so much N. We're kind of asking a lot of the vegetables here in order to take it all up, right? And what we're doing is we're applying a lot of N in an organic form, and then we're leaving it up to the environment and our management in order to make that available to the crop. And we're taking ourselves out of the equation when it comes to timing and crop demand. I mean, we're basically relying on we're relying on environmental conditions to make that available, and we have very little control over those conditions.
You did find, though, in other work in this system, that when you have a tarp over the soil, it does appear to significantly reduce nitrogen leaching losses.
Yeah, so that's a great point. That I think having a tarp on top of the soil, particularly over winter and early spring, where we found the largest effects, could potentially retain a lot of nitrogen. And so in this long-term trial, we did that. We had tarps down for over winter, 2 of the years, and for 6 weeks prior, and the other 2 years. But that one thing that we don't know, despite we conserve that nitrogen, is once that nitrogen or that tarp comes off, is that available to the plant when really it's just getting started? Is that the optimum time for that much nitrogen to be available to the plant when it may or not be the highest demanding time for that crop, right? So it's like that synchrony that is the issue. Even with tarps, that's with compost. It's like, are we synchronizing this? And it seems like it would be very hard to synchronize that in a compost mulch system. But the more plants you have, no doubt, more crops you have in there, the more living roots you have, the better. But it's such an enormous amount of material. It's hard to imagine tightening it up to the point where we're satisfied with that kind of nitrogen use efficiency.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show.
Getting transplants on there where those crops are closer to that point of rapid growth and uptake definitely could make a difference. But sometimes I think I think it can be hard to contextualize what like nitrate numbers mean. So nitrate, to remind folks, is the inorganic form of, it's one inorganic form of nitrogen. And because it is negatively charged, it doesn't really stick to any soil surfaces very well. And so if there's a rain, nitrogen is really susceptible to leaching, and it's also susceptible to denitrification. So if you have a lot of nitrate in your soil, it's just very susceptible to loss. It's kind of like waiting for a rainstorm to lose that nitrate. But to contextualize it, there has been work on the pre-side dress nitrate test. And typically for most crops, when that crop is like a few weeks old, if there's 30 to 40 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram of nitrogen, you do not need any additional nitrogen. That soil is going to keep feeding your crop plenty of nitrogen for the whole season. And I have seen nitrate numbers from people who've removed their tarps and then tested their, pretty heavy compost addition soils. I've seen nitrate at like 80 or 100 or like these levels that are very, very high.
Yeah, we have, every time we applied a tarp in this experiment, we measured nitrate after tarp removal. And it's definitely, it looks to be higher with tillage. You could minimize it in a no-till system, but it's definitely higher than you would need at that time the tarps are being removed, which is before crops are even in the ground. It definitely helps with an early start, but I don't necessarily think that compost and added N is being taken advantage of by the crop after tarp removal because of the magnitude of it. But that's a very good research question right there that we did not ask. When you have an experiment like this, we can kind of poke at these kinds of issues by looking at nitrate after tarp removal. But and nitrate at the end of the season or total land in soil. But to really get at this and to, try to account for nitrogen in the crop, looking at like nitrogen rates, looking at differences in crop growth across a nitrogen fertilizer gradient, something like that would help us kind of understand where and how the nitrogen is being used by the crop. So these kinds of questions could be asked in other studies for sure, to look at how tarps and particular could affect the nitrogen use, or the amount of nitrogen that the crop would need in fertilizer.
It's kind of like I'm not trying to point fingers or say that, what you're doing is bad, but I think that it's just important for people to know that even these systems that have organic inputs, compost is good, manure is good, but even organic inputs can turn into inorganic nitrogen, which can turn into pollution. So I think most people want to be conscientious about that. And so it's just like you said, another research question where we can there's a lot of room to probe the system a little more.
Yeah, we're not looking at flows. We did not look at like the flow of nutrients, which is to Jesse's point, would be a great next step if we had the capacity to do that, to really understand how nitrogen is moving, how much is being even removed from the bed into pathways, physically, or how much is infiltrating the soil and is leaching. All those questions can be asked.
It's just super hard to keep track of nitrogen. It changes all the time. I want to move on to actually I have one question first. So what was the feedstock for your compost? Where were you getting your compost?
So we're getting our compost from the Cornell Compost Facility, Farm Services, which is based on campus. And so they use some manure, from some of the barns, like grass clippings from research farms. So, and actually they have a relatively consistent process when it comes to that. We analyzed over the course of the trial, and, there wasn't a tremendous amount of variability in nutrients or bulk density or other kinds of things from year to year. So animal based. So that is something to take into account when we talk about phosphorus too, like when we have manure in it. And so the consideration, maybe not all farmers are using animal-based manures. Maybe they can find other ones that have less P or less N available. That's another question.
Yeah. So what did you observe for phosphorus?
Let's start with inputs. So in compost mulch, we're applying relative to this kind of standard practice of fertilizer application, about 10 times as much total P in compost mulch compared to, say, the Crayer's pelletizing compost that we were using. So very high, even higher rates than nitrogen relative to fertilizer. So a lot of compost here, a lot of compost P, I should say. And we really didn't look much at phosphorus within the growing season or kind of those annual changes. We looked at it after 4 years. We measured extractable P, so basically an index of available phosphorus to the plant using what's called a modified Morgan test that's used for Cornell recommendations. And so in the compost mulch treatment, we had, based on that, 165 pounds per acre of phosphorus in compost mulch, compared to somewhere around 30 to 40 pounds per acre in other treatments.
If you could sort of put that in context for what is, like, if you get your soil test back, what is considered, low, medium, high, above?
So 40 would be very high, like excess, like don't apply anymore. 20 parts per million, or roughly 40 pounds per acre. What was interesting is I just spoke to the 4-year numbers, but after the first year and one application, we hit that mark. So in one application, we were over that 40 pounds per acre rate, and then it continued to climb with every new application. So that's totally an issue. It's extremely high P, not as mobile as N, but can still move. And so it makes me think about, how much compost do we really need to apply to get some of these benefits? Can we potentially source a different type of compost that doesn't have these, that's not adding this level of P? Or a lot of questions that I think about when you apply that much in one. There's really little that you can do to manage it once it's in soil.
We in the Northeast tend to be importers of animal feed. And so therefore we tend to have an excess of manure. So we're importers of phosphorus, and we tend to have excess phosphorus, which is why we have, trouble in various waterways, Lake Champlain, Great Bay, Chesapeake Bay, etc. But phosphorus is actually, globally really limited. And so once we it is kind of a pet topic of mine, and I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast before, but, once we stockpile phosphorus really in large quantities on these very small spaces, then that means that phosphorus is not available for places where it really is needed. So, global phosphorus is not an unlimited supply. So in addition to being a potential environmental contaminant, it's also just a limited nutrient that we need to be really cognizant of in terms of where we're applying it and how we're using it, because eventually we will run out. So, sorry, soapbox.
Yeah, I do think, that's the main question is how can we, clearly a lot of farmers are having success with this deep compost mulch system. How can we do it with less risk to losing these nutrients, and by stewarding these nutrients and moving them to other using them in other places, and not loading them onto our fields for potential loss. So these are really good questions.
Yeah, that you said that much better than I did. So I agree. What are the different ways that we can think about making compost that is as effective in terms of the weed suppressive and nutrient provisioning goals, but maybe not with the downsides?
Yeah, one thing that I learned by doing this research is just when we're talking about nutrients, but it's kind of remarkable how much compost mulch changes the structure of the soil that you're working with in a no-till system. We're in a gravelly loam in Freeville, lots of rocks, and you put that level of compost down and things just got a lot easier.
Yeah.
To basically put the plants in the ground without an extra effort. Weeds come out easier when you're pulling them.
Better water holding.
But yeah, so there was some real tangible management benefits that as students were doing these things, they're just like, wow, this is nice soil to work with. Yeah, and so that's what we experience, and I totally see the benefit. And then when we looked hard at the numbers, thinking about how do we find compromise here to use less and maintain some of these benefits. Maybe not all, but what can we do?
Yeah, well, that I want to talk about sort of years 5 through 8 when you did cut back on the amount of compost you were adding, and then I also want to leave time to get to the work you did on the weed seed banks. So which do you think we should do first?
Yeah, I can just quickly talk while we're talking about this, about the second iteration of this trial, and that'll actually suggest more about how we looked at the weed seed bank. And so I think it's important to highlight we wanted to continue this as long as possible with the funding that we had, to inherit the legacy of these treatments year after year. So with funding from Northeast SARE and some federal capacity funds, we were able to continue for another 4 years. So in total, we have 8 years under this 8 years of data from this experiment. But we made the decision after 4 to basically, in the case of deep compost mulch, to stop applying compost. We basically just wanted to look at the legacy of that treatment for the next 4 years without adding any more. And perhaps it would have been ideal if we had a side by side where we were continued to add it, and we had a as a comparison, but we didn't have that flexibility within the experiment that we had. So we basically just stopped adding it and changed the crop sequence. We planted lettuce. We planted broccoli. We went to a direct seeded crop. We planted beets in spring. And we planted cover crops in the fall, all across these same management treatments, and looked at some of the same agronomic parameters like crop yield, weeds, weed emergence, soil nutrients, labor, and that data is still kind of sitting in large part to be summarized for publication, but clearly looking at it, one thing that stuck out to both myself and Peyton Janikis down at the University of Maine, who really supported a lot of that second iteration at the University of Maine, is how compost continued to out yield other treatments. It was equivalent to or exceeded the rye mulch treatment every year, and was well above the control treatment. So when we applied that much compost and then stopped, we had that legacy continued when it came to yields. Some of the weed data I think we still need to look at. I don't have a lot of the results on labor because it takes quite a bit to summarize those pieces, and I don't expect we'll have as much economic or any economic data like we did in the first 4 years, because we don't have the same partners. But I think we can share some of the weeds, some details on nitrogen, and some details on crop yields at a minimum through future articles. And certainly my co-author Brian, who really I have to give credit for spearheading the Growing for Market article, it would really like to see that to come out to farmers. So despite, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, despite the change in my position or the goal is to get that information out so we can share some of those legacies. But I thought it was really interesting how we could take away the inputs of compost. We could take away the cost of compost. We could take away the labor of applying the compost, and at least from a a yield perspective, see that continue on. I think the main challenge for farmers, I would think, is whether or not you're going to get the same weed suppression benefits over time. And that's where I feel like at least we could start to ask. My thinking would be if we're not applying compost, we're going to ask other practices to kind of take the responsibility there. Can we use tarps? We're minimizing tillage, so we're reducing the amount of seeds that are coming from greater depths. Can we use tarps to suppress weeds in that system? Can we use, obviously use hay mulch that is not going to be adding those levels of nutrients? So a little bit more integrated approach, which I think a lot of farmers are doing and experimenting with. Cover crop, and of course, cover cropping in order to kind of have a more integrated approach toward weed management once you have changed your soils to the degree that you have.
Yeah. And so it sounds like I think a lot of farmers intuitively know this as well, that this system has sort of an establishment phase and then a maintenance phase, and getting more data on kind of, I don't know, optimizing those different phases. And you and I actually, I want to transition into the weed seed bank. You and I put in a failed proposal. In retrospect, I'm actually kind of glad.
It looked good to me. Looked very good.
I thought it was a great proposal. I'm kind of glad it didn't get funded, but one of the things that we proposed was to look at the weed seed bank in as sort of an establishment parameter, like looking at the weed seed bank in old hay fields, and then looking at different methods of establishing a no-till system to deplete the seed bank, and whether the initial seed bank was a good indicator of the seed bank going forward. I'm not sure. It was better when we wrote it, but it's been a while. But I think that initial seed bank is a really critical factor of success in these systems, and could also relate very much to how much mulch you need to get going, and whether you should do a bunch of tillage before you transition to no-till, or a bunch of tarping or whatever. I think that a lot of people look at a potential farm and they look at the soil maps and all that, but like this weed seed bank is really critical.
So to jump on that real quick, which one thing I think it's important to account for, is that, in this field that we were conducting this long-term trial, it had a history. Number one, it had a history of being cultivated, right? And so it wasn't a new field, as some farmers may be going into. It also didn't have a strong legacy of perennial weeds. And one thing as we talk with farmers and think about how to control weeds or perennial weeds in no-till system, and especially to basically not let them take hold. So we would, if I'm talking mainly about quackgrass here, some yellow nutsedge, but mainly quackgrass. If we did have it, if it did pop up in some areas, we put the labor into controlling it basically as much as we can physically through hand weeding, more or less, for those problem areas. And that's really been one of the things I've also taken away from some of these farmer conversations. You talked about, like, well, what if we go into a new field? What can we expect? The other one is, well, what if we already know we have perennial weeds? What can we expect? And I think it wouldn't be as easy to do these practices if we had that persistence of perennial weeds in our experiment.
Yeah. So you did look at the weed seed bank. Was it after 4 years or 8 years? I can't remember.
Yeah, so we looked at it at 7 years, just, not quite at the end, but it was really determined by an undergraduate student project. Stephen Strussow, who was an undergraduate at the time and now is doing a PhD over at Michigan State, and particularly his interests were in weed management. So what that looked like is that at the end of year 7, Stephen went out there and he took some soil cores from not every treatment out there, but a subset of treatments to about 10 centimeters, if I recall. And he brought those cores back to the greenhouse. A number of cores, as much soil as he could felt like was representative of the plot, and laid these out on like greenhouse flats, basically. and then proceeded over the course of several months to germinate any of the weeds that were in that soil. So that looked like, optimum temperature, moisture, so watering in the greenhouse, and then letting weeds germinate within all the soil that was collected from these plots. And then counting them by species before and removing them, mixing them up and doing it again. So multiple iterations of this to kind of flush the weeds out of the soil and count them as we go. So we identified the numbers of weeds and species that were present over these simulated tillage events within the greenhouse. And counting, you have to learn to count your weeds as they're very small. Basically, what does a seedling look like of these certain weeds? We're pretty familiar with the weeds that we're dealing with because we're hoeing them and we're cultivating them and we're counting them in the field, but we didn't really have a good estimate of this is one way of looking at the accumulated impact of these practices over time, right? Instead of what's emerging at one point in a cropping season. So that was the approach to look at this kind of sum of all the viable weed seeds in the soil or the weed seed bank.
And what did he find?
Well, first, 2 weeds comprised a majority of all the weeds. I think it was as much as like 75% were between common chickweed and hairy gallinsoga. So a very dominant winter annual weed and chickweed in our plots, and then the dominant summer annual being gallinsoga. So that was one, but that's something that maybe we could expect, but we didn't know the proportions, or we also didn't know if I should say we did the same thing with our compost. We wanted to know if our compost was introducing weeds that we were not taking into account. And interestingly, that was basically the third dominant weed, which is oak leaf goosefoot, which is not a primary. You don't really think about that as common, reducing yields or based on its structure or size and competitiveness with crops. But oak leaf goosefoot was almost 100% of, if you did the same thing in compost, all of it was oak leaf goosefoot. It was kind of interesting. So I do remember that early on, that oak leaf goosefoot was a weed that we were counting, that we were seeing, but that to me describes kind of where that was coming from, which also gets to the point of like where your compost is coming from and what you're introducing into your system in the form of weed seeds. But interestingly, when it comes to tillage practices, so we had like 2 main effects. One was tillage and one was mulch. In tillage, we had the lowest total weed density in no-till and no-till tarp systems. And so that was really awesome.
You pretty much practiced a 0 seed rain management in this. So it wasn't like these weed seeds were coming from the years of your growing. This was all in the seed bank before your experiment was initiated?
I cannot say that. No, I cannot say that. I cannot say that we were able to maintain these treatments with no seed rain. But we put an effort into minimizing that, particularly in the no-till systems, because we recognized that was going to be a primary pathway for those weeds to be introduced. Pulling large weeds. I mean, what it looked like in a tarp system is that if we had that window, we had the tarp on the soil surface. So in the case of chickweed, it didn't have a chance in winter or early spring to even establish, where we would terminate it with the tarp before it could make seed. So I think actually we talked a lot about maybe fatal germination with tarps, and weeds underneath tarp germinating and then dying and then removing them. But I think we use tarps in a way that kind of let that in that no-till system that controlled chickweed to the point where it wasn't setting seed and it wasn't getting established. Whereas in a tilled system, it would more so, and we required multiple tillage events in order to terminate it. And so clearly the no-till systems plural were doing a better job at controlling chickweed. And the other flip side of it was Gallant Soga, as I mentioned. That was where our mulches were making the difference. And there was no difference between, say, the rye mulch and the compost mulch, but we found about, I think it was close to 1/3, or reduced by 1/3 relative to unmulched soils. So when we have the mulch in place throughout the growing season, we're more likely to control those summer annual weeds like Gallant Soga under a canopy of winter squash, for example. And so to me, that made a lot of sense. So this combination of no tillage and mulch, you would expect to have the lowest weed seed density. And that's what we found.
Well, I've kept you longer than I promised. It's been really great to talk. And I know it's not your job anymore. So maybe we'll just really encourage Brian to get on writing up that last few years for growing for market.
Something that we're very committed to doing. You mentioned this whole idea, and that's really Cornell Small Farms is about, is extending this information to farmers. So that's where our commitment was this whole time, is having workshops, writing articles in Small Farm Quarterly, and learning, trying to give these tidbits of information through presentations. It just takes a little bit more to bring it to a whole, and feel satisfied to summarize all the pieces together. So, but after it's all done, but I hope we can continue to feed some of those results, and I hope to also continue to learn from what farmers are doing to change things and improve upon their systems too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks to Ryan for revisiting this past life to talk about this research project. I encourage you all to check out the many resources they put together at Cornell from this project, and also to check out the tarping guide that Ryan and I co-authored with some other folks. It has a lot of the results from this research project in it, as well as some others. I hope everyone has a happy holiday season, and we'll meet again in the new year.
Right, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Always make sure to check the links in the show notes for how to follow our guests and hosts. The No-Till Market Garden podcast is a free show that is supported by folks like you who contribute every month over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. That support helps ensure all the shows we do, from the Seed Farmer podcast to the Winter Growers podcast, the Collaborative Farming podcast, the Composter podcast, Growers Daily, and of course the No-Till Market Garden podcast, can continue to go and grow. You can also find books and hats, as well as an active forum over at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge thank you to editor Michael Sellis and producer Jackson Roulette for all their work on this show and the rest of the team over at no-tillgrowers.com. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and make sure you are subscribed wherever you're hearing this so you don't miss the next episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. See you then.